Welcome to our rescheduled book discussion of The Night Watchman and the first book discussion in 2022 of Metropolitan Community College's 14th Annual Diversity Matters book series. Happy New Year to everyone. Thank you for your patience to join us in exploration of The Night Watchman with Dr. Barbara K. Robbins. My name is Barbara Velasquez. I'm the coordinator of International Intercultural Education. Your microphones and chat with other audience members are turned off. You may always send a chat message to any of the hosts. As we move through today's presentation, send questions at any time. In fact, if you already know some questions you want to ask, it's fine to send those through the chat to moderator Barbara Velasquez. I will present your questions to our discussion leader. Also, watch the chat for an online evaluation link. And if you would like a copy of this book, also send your name and email to moderator Barbara Velasquez, and we will have a drawing for a copy of The Night Watchman after the event. Barbara K. Robbins, Ph.D., is an associate professor of English at the University of Nebraska, Omaha, with teaching interests in Native American literature and humanities, fine arts, and veterans literature. She has taught in UNO's Native American Studies program since 1999 and has research interests in contemporary Native American literature and fine arts that invoke issues of historical grief, post-traumatic stress disorder, and healing endeavors, including the Wellbriety movement, Native American veterans, and Indigenous language preservation topics. Please welcome today's discussion leader, Barbara K. Robbins, PhD.
Thank you. Such a pleasure. I'm so glad that you asked me to participate in this event. And I also want to thank not only Barbara, but also my good colleague and friend, Dr. Jesseline Anderson, for her support. And my friend, sister, Cassie Carroll. I didn't see her face. I hope she's watching. I guess I'd like to start off by saying that, no, I'm not going to do a real lecture. I have a little PowerPoint, but it's, I think, nice to see just some of the, I guess, mostly the number of the sheer volume of publications that Louise Erdrich has put forward throughout her writing career. And then a couple of other points related to determination, which this book has been getting, of course, most of its publicity about. So Isaac, I'm ready for that PowerPoint. So just as a way of introducing this topic, there you will see quite a number of dates and some other stats here and there, but I didn't have a great deal of time to go through and fact check these. So take them, I guess, as guidelines at this point, partly because, like saying her publications, sometimes I would see a year off. I guess it depends on how people were categorizing when a book appeared. Or also, Erdrich also revised some of her fiction. So if we go ahead and go to the next slide, I thought I always like to start my classes. I always like to start with a map of the region that we're talking about. So this is a contemporary map of North Dakota, and you'll see way up north near the Canadian border is the Turtle Mountain Reservation. And just so you know, FYI, but there's always the family weather report in my family. And then I also did a lookup for Turtle Mountain, and it was negative 25 there this morning. So if you're feeling chilled, just think how much warmer it is here. And I think it's important to remember that this novel starts in September and goes through to March. So the kind of winters that are described in the novel, I think, you can get a better sense of the kinds of really tough conditions that Thomas and Patrice, our characters, are dealing with in a North Dakota or Minnesota winter. Okay, let's go to the next slide. So this is some information. I just went online and I put the title of the website down below, their book series in order. And then I created these chunks of her titles. She has a lot of titles. So these are what's often, they call them the love medicine books. And other scholars have referred to them as the Reservation Series. But it's also interesting to note that in these books, Erdrich used or created a fictionalized version of Turtle Mountain. It was referenced, but it was very, non-specific. It was one of those kind of fluid geographies, you might say. I guess I don't make the point that some of these books she also revised, as this is particularly true of Love Medicine, which was published in its first version in 1984. But there have been subsequent versions with additions, and I think even one deletion, one chapter deletion. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So her best known poem probably is Jacklight. This is a collection by the same title. She's done picture books. She did some nonfiction work, and occasionally you'll see that name Michael Doris, who was her husband and the father of her children. He had adopted children, so they had 3 adopted children at the time of their getting together. And so they were known for collaborating, and so you will see a few titles with his name attached. Let's go on to the next one. And these are her children's books. She's been working on them. Like, it seems like if you look at the full dates, it's almost like they alternate. She'll have an adult novel and then a children's novel all in the same year. And the next slide in this series. This is the last one of the next slide, please. Oh, thank you. So this is the last series of publications, and this particular website referred to these as the standalone novels. And we could quibble because there are still significant overlaps or connections with the so-called reservation or North Dakota novels, even in something as like, say, contemporary, and kind of seems far removed from the period in which, like, say, Love Medicine is written. The La Rose, for example, still has a couple of character mentions from that earlier generation. So on this particular list, see, Plague of Doves, published in 2008. This book was nominated for a Pulitzer in 2009. And of course, Night Watchman did receive the Pulitzer in 2021. Okay, next slide. So I guess I'm going to occasionally put on my teacher hat, and just to let you know that there's Louise, of course, as you saw, that she has a lot of, she calls it Chippewa in the book. It's Ojibwa. And if you say those two things together really fast, Chippewa, Ojibwa, you can hear that one is actually a derivation of the other. And so it's one of the challenges to doing Native American studies, Native American literature, is that these names have been filtered through so many other European languages. Like, who are you talking about? What are we talking about? Sometimes can be really confusing. And so this is the Ojibwa People's Dictionary. And I used this is just a screenshot, so it's not live, but I used it to find out how exactly do I say Thomas's last name, Wajishk. And so I've had to practice, and that's something that, yeah, we have to practice. But I think it's also part of Erdrich's intention. She's been learning the language. She wants other people exposed to the language. It's there. There's lots of resources, particularly for Ojibwa, or actually the more official name for the language, Anishinaabe. So any of those terms, whichever you search on, you will find resources that will help you to understand, to pronounce, to learn, as well as other languages. There's lots of them in the Americas, and so many of them are endangered. All right, well, let's go on to some history. The next slide, I talk a little bit about the issue of termination. And again, this is the information that I found, which seemed to be pretty reputable sites, but it differs from the information that Erdrich has herself in the afterword of the book. And it's a matter of like deep history. Maybe you have to see what kind of categories She says there were 113 tribes terminated, whereas I found 109. Maybe it's a way, it's a different time frame, or maybe it's a different categorization of under what conditions. Nonetheless, we're pretty close. We're in the ballpark. There were a lot of tribes that were terminated. And as a result, there were a lot of people who lost tribal affiliation and a sense of home, a sense of belonging. Also, then there was the practicality of not only land, but the resources on that land that were lost, sold outright, and basically created economic devastation, the exact opposite of what the federal government had hoped for. Let's go on to the next slide. So this is a photograph of our Senator Arthur Watkins, and this is straight out of Wikipedia. Just like Erdrich herself, there is a great deal of information out there that's not difficult to find. But I did try to supplement with a couple of other resources, and so I have my books here. So I'm gonna read just a couple of lines from The Nations Within, by Vine Deloria and Clifford Little. And this is about some of what we see in the novel, which is the clamoring for the termination policy and the way in which, of course, the politics of it. Deloria and Little describe some political maneuvering on the part of the Republican Party. And so he says in his book, the reason for holding joint sessions was to forestall any effort to sidetrack the terminal legislation. The joint subcommittee could ensure that each house in Congress had identical language in its bill, thereby eliminating the need for a conference to reconcile differences, a step in the procedure where most compromises are made and a place where tribes had traditionally stopped bad legislation. So there was, I saw the word unprecedented, that this was an unprecedented move on the part of people in office to ensure the success of the passing of this bill. And I'm also going to read a little bit from Red Man's Land, White Man's Law by William Watchman. This one I thought was, gives us another glimpse, another little bit of information that we can use to imagine the homes of Patrice and Thomas and others that are living on Turtle Mountain. Although Indian income during the war year of 1944 was 2.5 times that of 1938, 1/3 of the Indian families resident on the reservations had incomes of less than $500 in 1944, and nearly 2/3 received less than $1,000. So I didn't get a chance. Anybody happen to know why $500 in today's money is? I mean, that's not a great deal of money to be, especially when you have a family. And as we saw in the case of LeBlatt, Thomas wasn't even sure of how many family members he was trying to support on the one job there at the jewel bearing factory. All right, let's go on to the next slide. So this one I added just because it's local. This is Omaha World Herald, and it's a photograph that I came upon recently thanks to another Facebook site. And as you'll see, the date 1957. And I thought this is a pretty good example of how, again, our time period and how mainstream attitudes, the mainstream, I'm just going to say, obliviousness to their neighbors, to the condition or the sensitivity of their neighbors. And so this says, this was the caption originally published in 1957, and in which it describes these women as putting a busy afternoon this weekend as they prepare to feed their hungry braves who are participating in the annual powwow at Macy. So I'm going to call it for what it is. This is the language of savagery. This is the language of domination, putting the whole we're civilized and you're savage, that kind of binary firmly in place. And so this is, of course, also feeding into that, well, ironically, in a way, that even though they're savage, well, they must be economically able to support themselves. Therefore, we're going to terminate or abrogate is the other term, abrogate the treaty arrangements between federal government and the tribes. All right, one more slide. And another local connection that this, just to remember, if you weren't aware of it, that it had a very, very real impact on the Ponca tribe, who were not able to escape termination. And the date here, you'll see that the termination was started in 1962, but the final abrogation, the termination of the relationship was official in 1966. And that resulted in over 400 Poncas removed from tribal roles. And then there's another term here, restoration. And I got this off of the Ponca website. So of course, they're making the point that, that's not a done deal. We're still here. We're still we're still living. So I'll add to this by saying that restoration or re-recognition had to happen because the termination was so economically devastating. It was also culturally devastating and psychologically devastating, that the federal government had to reverse and began the process of re-recognizing, or in this language, restoring tribes. So nearly all of the terminated tribes were re-recognized, a point that Erdrich also mentions in the afterward. She gives better numbers, but it was at a cost. In the case of the Ponca, it was the entire land base. In the case of other tribes, it was, of course, land, it was other resources, it was the culture itself was damaged. All right, last slide. And then I found a photograph of Erdrich's grandfather. This is Patrick Moses Borneau. This is the man who was the tribal chairman and the character or the person for which the character Thomas is based on. So there we go. I hope that helps. We can end the PowerPoint now. Thank you, Isaac. My question for you folks then, and I don't know how many of you are out there today, but did you know about termination going into this? Had you heard of it? Just knew of it well? I imagine that I can see some people nodding. Teresa Foley, I know that you know. Anybody else? Had you heard of it? I don't see number of faces, so I can't really tell. But I know I'm going to be making a number of points about not only history, but American education. As you know, I teach at UNO, and I'm always getting people who are future teachers. And it's not at all uncommon to run into people who, after going through the classes, are really shocked and angry at how little we're teaching our children about our American history involving Native Americans, Indigenous peoples. So if you didn't know about termination, you would not be alone. This would be more of the norm, really. So I'm going to move on to another question, which I hope I do get some comments for. So just speaking in generally about Erdrich and a Native American novel. What is a Native American novel? I'd like to know what your expectations are or were for a Native American novel, in particular, what you thought of when you sat down to read The Night Watchman.
So let me say too, if there's somebody in the audience who'd like to respond verbally, raise your hand and we'll open your microphone.
Great.
But maybe before we do that, we do have people who would like to understand what termination is. That question is coming through.
It keeps coming up. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, and I'm not a political expert or political science expert, but that term abrogate, that's to abrogate or to end the treaty relationships between a tribe and the federal government. And so like it says throughout the novel itself, that it was packaged in this, this language of, well, we're doing you a favor. We're going to bring you into American mainstream, make you full citizens. And of course, for a number of tribal people, they're like scratching their heads going, well, wait a minute, I'm already a citizen of my nation. And then there's, I guess there was the idea that they would have more access to, like, say, economic development, especially if they were relocated off of reservations, rural areas into more urban areas. And that's something that our characters comment on throughout, that, well, they didn't want to leave their home. They didn't want to live in the city. There's a lot of Native American novels, especially the early ones from the 60s to the 80s, where this identity issues is often comes right along with this, some of the other precursor policies like relocation, where people were encouraged to leave reservations to go to major cities to get jobs. And so termination was seen as yet another, a stronger push. Just pull the plug on the treaty. You won't be like you won't be a special Native American. You'll just be a regular American. You'll pay taxes. You'll have all of the rights, privileges thereof. But from the Native point of view, it was going to be the loss of course, the land, and language are inherently wrapped up in each other. So does that help, Barbara, do you think?
I think
You
that
want to weigh in on that too?
I would throw out, often when we have people come to the discussion, they may not have had a chance to finish the book, or maybe sometimes even get started. So to whet your appetite, those of you who want to do termination, one of the things I found interesting was the point that termination from a federal standpoint meant one thing, but to the local communities, it also meant they were going to have to take on responsibilities, financial responsibilities that they didn't have previously, like funding the schools. I remember that, that when Thomas was fighting this, he tries to get those elected officials in neighboring areas to tell the federal government, wait, we can't fund the hospital, we can't fund. So, I mean, there's so many, I guess, tiny variables that we don't think about, even out of the cultural destruction.
Yeah, thanks for those additional points. And I was wondering, I didn't know exactly when I wanted to introduce this, but this seems like a good time to introduce, because I think the question is still on the table about what do you expect from a Native American novel? And I suspect, having talked to other students, that well, I hear that, well, I want to learn more about Native American cultures. Like, okay, and you will. But there's a caution. I put a caution by that particular expectation, simply because these are also works of art, and these are not anthropological. These are not sociological texts. So you're going to learn, but you're not. It's not the same as watching a documentary. You know what I mean? So. So I'm going to ask some other questions kind of related to that. And one of them, so those of you who have read the novel, I'd really like to know, where did you find yourself in this novel? You know, we talk about, oh, I really attached to this character. It seemed like a me character. That was me in this story. Or I had a lot of sympathy. I had this character was so familiar, that experience was so familiar. I just had a lot of empathy for this character, this situation. So I'll answer that question first. It didn't take very long at all for me to find myself in the novel. And I was surprised because it was connected to Senator Watkins himself. And it was the descriptions of Watkins as being, well, he's Mormon, so he was very religious, conservative. And strangely, it was the descriptions of the Palmer method. He's described as practicing the Palmer method, which it's like lots of drawing, lots of loops and making your letters. And that all of this describes my grandfather. So my grandfather, he was Rayford Lee, he went by R.L. Robbins, and his age, his time is very, very similar. It's almost exactly the same as Watkins and Borneau, Erdrich's grandfather. So my grandfather was born in 1900, died in 1985, and he was elected to the Montana State Senate in 1953. So in the state of Montana, he was serving during the time when this termination bill came through. So that was, I guess, a moment where like, wow, as a non-native studying Native American literature, there are lots of moments where like, okay, I have to step back and remember and recall my position in relationship to the story or the people who are telling the story. This one was a little bit sharper than usual. And I'm going to read a portion of the summary of the bill. This is from, I have photocopies here of the 34th Legislative Assembly of the state of Montana, which commenced January 3rd, 1955, and ended in March of 1955. And this is the introduction of Senate Joint Memorial Number 7, introduced by Robbins et al., requesting the appropriation of sufficient federal funds be set aside as an emergency fund for Indian relief and welfare of all kinds to be used during the period of adjustment, when the United States government shall withdraw from the field of providing medical, hospital, and other welfare and security needs of the ward Indians of the United States. And that was referred to the Committee on Indian Affairs. So that for me was, I didn't know about that when he was still alive. I didn't get a chance to ask him before he passed away. Finding that in family history was a surprise. But it also, I think, another part of that, like you were saying, Barbara, there were a lot of services that were going to be taken away from tribes because of termination. And I guess I can be glad that he thought to try to put something on a safety net in place. But it's also not nearly to the case of our character Thomas, who of course is working to just stop it. No, we just can't do this. So anyway, there's quite a bit on the table here. I'd like to hear some more comments or questions. What do you expect, or where did you find yourself?
As we wait for an answer, everybody get ready because we're going to let you get involved. We do have a comment based on something you just shared regarding the sociological study that people might expect. A thesis advisor said of every Native American novel we read that it was a sociological study. This is the difference between taking a class from a traditional literary faculty member and an expert faculty member.
Yeah, it's a great discussion point. Some like say Mama Day, for example, he's so powerful and probably could be said to be one of those more sociological writers. Erdrich and Silko, who's another one of my big favorites, I think that they probably bend things more in the artistic, more of the creative, and they're not afraid to mix up, to kind of bend. Of course, Native American storytelling is often more fluid. It's described as circular. And I can see a lot of that kind of structure in this novel. It's not, we're going to start here and then we'll just move to the narrative and then, no. We get a lot of different voices, polyvocal, that's the term for having a story that's told by many voices. And Erdrich is probably the one that's really made this, I guess, really famous, and especially in Native American literature. She was Love Medicine was a huge game changer for Native Lit. And this having so many voices, she's a master at it.
I will say that that caught me right away, that like every chapter you were, I think, when do I get to hear about her again? Or what?
Yeah.
But I also made it very interesting. By the way, Tracy Bridgeford wanted you to know she made the comment about the sociological.
I could tell that was Tracy. Thank you.
Do you find, Barbara, that your students have a little difficulty with by having an expectation that it's going to be sociological and not artistic? Do they
I think
to
so.
adjust?
Yeah, because, and this is something, another point that I want to make about this novel is that, and some novelists, and when I say this, I tend to think, first of all, Leslie Silko, and then Sherman Alexie. There are some novelists that it's like, okay, reader, hang on to your shorts because I'm going to push. And they really give their readers a hard time. They don't make anything easy. It's a novel. It's a narrative. It's like there's lots of experiences in there that are expected. And we read a book, we want to be challenged maybe, but sometimes those two authors in particular it's like finger in the face. It's just really sometimes sharp and abrupt, or it's so culturally shaped that those of us who grew up in those kind of cultures are like baffled. What's going on here? So I see Erdrich doing much more of that than I typically feel like I've seen in her previous novels. I think that usually her novels are community dramas, and sometimes, although there's some very comedic sections, but this book is probably the only one that comes to mind where I just do not recall any other where she's like in the reader's face, like take responsibility for your position here. And so that's why I was wondering, where did you find yourself? If you did read this, or even if you're just getting started, and I had a note to that effect. I guess the feeling is also a characteristic of, there's so many characters who are described as expressing feelings. So I don't mean that lightly as how do you feel, or where did you find yourself? Because I think it's also important to understanding a lot of our characters. How are they finding themselves? How are they feeling about this act of termination or the other things going on in their lives? Thomas, who's just now been as a night watchman, now dividing up his time, even his few precious hours of sleep that he gets. Now he has to deal with this tremendous onslaught of the federal government. Or Patrice having a sister who's disappeared, and the constant worry, being proud of her job, but concerned for how she's going to keep it together. Or Barnes, Haystack Barnes, the math teacher, the boxing coach. He's a really interesting character too, because it's like, I think even one of the characters just thinks of him as, you poor thing, you're just so pitiful. He's just kind of dumbstruck. He's love-struck over Patrice, and she dismisses him, and he just doesn't know what to do with himself. And I think he's a lot like a lot of my students in some respects. Like, oh, if I just do this thing, then these people, the community I'm with, they will accept me. They will like me. And I wish I didn't find that section to put the page number in my notes, but I think that between Patrice and maybe Patrice's mother, there was some like, just be a good guy. just be a friend. We'll get to know you. We'll either like you or we don't, much less of the sometimes magical thinking.
I read that I don't know if I can identify with any one character, but Patrice's home seemed like a haven to me, right? And when you would read about, or she would be describing, or her mother would describe, or you would imagine the baby that comes back. It just seems whatever difficulty they had in life, that was a structure that was going to get them through. It warm uncomfortable to think about that. And I probably was placing other people that I knew and could identify with as that household, right?
Uh-huh.
And the
Yeah.
fear that of the dad was.
Yeah. Yeah. That was palpable, wasn't it?
Mhm,
Yeah.
mhm,
Yeah.
yeah. So
And
I was going to say too, another thing that got me about the book was how I don't consider myself a great, like I'm not the person that really gets what's going on right away in anything, right? But the way that the author way down the road would give you information that explains something that was described earlier in the book happened to Patrice in the car, right?
Yeah.
And swimming across the lake and all of that. It was like, oh, and he gives us back and et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that's a pretty important moment, and it gets to one of the other themes that I saw going on in the book. So it's, of course, the lot of the reviews and the publicity about this book has been that, oh, it's based on Erdrich's grandfather and it's about termination, but it's about so much more than that, isn't it? And so I was really amazed at how much sex there is in this book. And so those of you who have not read it, you're all going, what? I gotta read it. I mean, so those of you who have read it, there's a lot of sex in this book, isn't there? Tracy,
to me, it wasn't in a way that was offensive, but I thought it pulled in. It's different than people that are afraid to talk about.
And that's one of the big cultural differences that I think that students run into this, and of course teachers run into this, because matters of sexuality are treated differently across different cultures. And white America, however you want to describe a big section of our country culturally, there are religious perspectives. And of course, a lot of the characters, even in our book, are Catholic. And then of course, we have the Mormon characters. And so there's a lot of reticence to talk about sex or to appreciate sex as normal. But in contrast, we've got, oh my gosh, just so many mentions of and descriptions of, and some of it is just downright hysterical. I mean, if you got to the part about the homecoming parade, then you saw the total chaos that those two horses created, because teacher's pet was in estrus and Gringo said, yeah, babe. And so we've got these horses just really tearing up the parade and running through the swing set. And then a really wonderful chapter right after that for a minute there, I was puzzled as to, well, who are we talking about now? But so the very first line of this chapter is, after the sex was over, they were bored and irritated. That's on page 240, by the way, if you want to jump ahead. And, so I'm thinking, and I don't want, I say what you said, Barbara, that this is not offensive, but and yet in some cases it is. What happened to Vera is incredibly offensive. That she was, maybe she just went, but the fact that she got taken to Minnesota and especially to Duluth, and she was trafficked, obviously raped and abused to a significant degree, addicted to drugs. I mean, it's amazing she survived. And so Erdrich is at this point doing a little bit of a shaping, a little twist on, she's talking much more about contemporary awarenesses of what we now call the missing and murdered Indigenous women. Of course, it was happening in the 50s and the 60s, but it didn't have the same awareness that we have for it today. And I did a quick look up. I was trying to find a little history of sex trafficking in this particular region. that it's known today that Great Lakes area is definitely a significant location of indigenous sex trafficking. And I did find one article out of the Toronto Star that, and this was from 2013, that in the very first line of this article, it says, on the docks of Duluth, Minnesota, it's called working the boats. And it's referring to prostitution, it's referring to the kind of trafficking that too often young girls, they're saying some as young as 10, the average age is 14. So I think that if we're going to say that, well, the sex in Erdrich's novel, what is it there for? I think some of it's, when you say it's a wake-up call, we should be offended. And then there's the other entertaining aspects of it. I mean, Patrice dressed up in that rubber blue ox suit, the water jack. And like, oh my gosh, what the heck?
It's over and over in the book. She does such a good job of just incorporating so many real pieces of life.
Yeah. Yeah. And what do you mean by real pieces of life? Elaborate on that.
You know, I don't know if it was 50s or 60s, television tried to make us think that every household was very, the Leave It to Beaver household.
Yeah, it's the classic story.
And I suppose you felt like if you didn't have that family, there was something wrong with you. Well, Louise is showing you that lots of stuff goes on.
Yeah.
And she's real about the complexity of life, I guess I would say. And maybe, I mean, I think it can be a very good piece of education about the challenges people who live on reservations are forced off of reservations, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, and
was unaware.
Poverty.
Right.
Yeah. It's of course, indigenous girls and women have been exploited to a tremendous degree, as we're finding out, but of course they're not the only ones. And so the way in which we socially, culturally, the way we allow so much of this trafficking to take place, or in the case of Patrice, performing in this sexualized outfit for the benefit of mostly men, I would suppose, coming into this bar with this logging and Paul Bunyan theme. And so, I mean, I guess I never really thought about it until I read this book. It's like, oh yeah, we've got an ox, which is male, named Babe. Okay, never thought of that before, but now we've got a woman dressed in a blue ox suit pretending to be a male. I was like, what? There's a lot of crazy gender bending going on in here, isn't there? And of course, in Native American, in the old indigenous stories, this kind of gender fluidity is not unusual. There's especially characters is not a great term here, but in the stories, they appear as characters about those beings that have greater than human capabilities. So like tricksters, for example, and there's others too, other beings that can change their form and do things, and they're not limited to one gender. And they do things in a different kind of spectrum than us human beings. So I could see a little of culturally that some of the sex involved in the book is derived from a different point of view culturally, but I still think it's more than that, because there's frequent mentions of how in Chippewa, everything is funnier. Or Roderick, remember the ghost Roderick? That he even says that he likes to hang out at Patrice's house because her mom, Janot, likes to talk and tell stories, and there are lots of words for sex. And he is, of course, he's a kid, right? He likes to hang out and listen to. And then there's Eddie Meek. oh, I have my lap. There's Eddie Mink, who is, of course, is the oftentimes alcoholic, but he's considered by Thomas and the committee who are fighting the termination laws that he's one of the most astute. And I have to read this because I only have a cryptic note in my notes. But on 183, when they're preparing for the meeting in Fargo, he says, this is Eddie Mink. Fool, I got some wisdom for you. Listen up. Government is more like sex than people think. When you are having good sex, you don't appreciate it enough. When you are having bad sex, it is all you can think of. And it's like, okay, well, there's a lot of humor on here, obviously, but some interesting points too. Aren't there some connections? Any thoughts on, anybody want to talk about sex today? Because just in case, you know, the words for this is pretty far into the book. But I was, besides just having been told by, even Patrice says this several times throughout, that that things were always funnier when said in Chippewa. And at the top of page 337, there's all these, the whole chapter is devoted to different voices giving little updates, you might say. And then there's one captioned words. The word used for ejaculation, bajingi, is used for shooting off a gun. The word used for condom means gun case. Like, okay, nice to know. But I also saw, okay, there's an interesting thread through here that connects guns, violence, stereotypes, and of course, I guess the introduction of guns made it a convenient metaphor to use as those words, but also think about guns, what guns did for the culture. And part of the stereotype of Indians and guns and violence. I think you're probably calling up a whole lot of old Westerns in your head right about now. I hope so. I thought it was very interesting and a challenge to some of the other stereotypes of Indianness. That, you remember Harry? He's the one who found the unconscious Farah on the street and takes her home and helps her out, tries to get a relationship going with her, but apparently she's just not going to work for her. So when spoiler alert, when she returns home, the thing that she tries to give him as a thank you gift is the family gun. And I thought, wow, that's really interesting. Of all the things that she could say, you know, thank you for saving my life, I'm going to give you our family gun. Practical, it was a matter of value, but I don't think that Erdrich's creating of this novel, I don't think that was accidental or like say poorly considered. So I guess on this theme of stereotype, and my mom and I were talking about this earlier, that there's some really interesting stuff going on with, I'm calling it alternative ways of knowing. And so it doesn't matter really how far you've got in the book, that pretty quickly you come upon dreams. Characters are having dreams. And of course, that's part of the stereotype, isn't it? You know, Indians, and I am, you probably noticed I've been using that term Indians all through this because I am invoking the stereotype. And just like Thomas King and others have said, Indian is a fictional being. Indians were made up by non-natives to suit different purposes. So in this case, I think it's interesting that Erdrich is, of course, she's referring to dreams. Dreams are important. And in fact, they're so important that Patrice and her mother share dreams of Vera and do figure out that, yeah, she's still alive. We need to go get her. Other stereotypes. Oh, go ahead.
We have a comment, a couple
Yeah.
comments come in. When you mentioned the intentionality of use of the gun and the sex.
Good.
This is from Tracy again. I don't think Erdrich ever did anything by accident.
Yeah, I don't
Everything in all of her writing is intentional. She also wanted to share that that thesis advisor compared Erdrich to Faulkner.
Well, and that would be a compliment because Erdrich was a big fan. She studied Faulkner in college and really admired his writing. So she did in her early work, she did try to model a lot of her writing off of Faulkner. So yeah. It's a great connection. Was there another comment?
Those kind of two went together.
Those two? Okay. So I guess if we're developing that so-called stereotype of Indians, then what other features are you seeing in here? I think at any point in the book, there's something. Anybody have any thoughts?
Stereotypes is the question. Is that your question? What?
Yeah, if you saw examples of what could be the stereotype, the Indian stereotype. Oh, I see Kathy Nelson.
You raising your hand, Cassie?
Yeah, she raised her hand.
So can we open Cassie, Cassandra, Carol's mic, or just allow for everybody to open up right now in case there's any questions? You got that, Isaac? I see Kathy Nelson with a hand.
Yeah, I just.
Can you do that, Isaac?
Okay.
Can
you hear me?
Oh, yes.
Thank you.
Cassie. We see you, Cassie. Go ahead.
Hi, Barb.
Hey, how are
when
you?
you first mentioned it, good. How are you? We got a lot of snow here in Nashville. It's still snowing. Nashville. When you asked if what you thought of the novel, I mean, I've read many of her novels, and I see she has many similar themes. And I think my favorite theme throughout her book, and not so much this one, is the humor. And you're on the badass. As Native women, we are always making that comment, like, okay, who's ass is flattered? Mine, you know? Because we're Native women, majority of us, we don't have, nice buxom passes like some other people. Or some, just kind of flat, So I got a bit of that. I just humor, but I also love all the many things that she incorporates. This book reminded me a little of Roundhouse a little bit.
Roundhouse. Yeah.
Domestic sexual abuse. I mean, when I read that one, what was the name of the daughter that was she was tied, she was
Vera, you're talking about Vera?
Used as an object. I was like, oh my God. I've never read something that graphic on that kind of sexuality or these men abusing her. I have read it in a book that was about Nanking, where the Japanese would force these Chinese women, force them to be sexual objects, and that was their life during that occupation time.
Yeah.
So it's just all her themes are just, I just keep looking for the different things because she seems to interweave a lot of it. That's the way she writes. Like I learned from Barbara, it's not linear. You know, it should go from talking back then to something more contemporary, and then maybe back to Thomas doing something. You know, and I really look forward to her writing.
Yeah.
So many important.
Thank-
So many.
Yeah, thanks, Cassie. Your bandwidth is a little low, but thanks for jumping in. And Kathy Nelson, where are you? Did you want to jump in too?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, okay. When we were talking about the stereotypical ideas in the book, the whole jewel shop, the way that boss was towards the workers,
Oh,
towards
yeah.
Thomas, towards the women, the way he set the women up against each other, he didn't trust them. It was just so appalling. And that's the way it was.
Yeah. Good. Oh, thank you. Yeah. There's a lot of there's different cases that both of you have mentioned. It's just there's a lot of exploitation that's being it's acknowledged, even if maybe we don't. The novel isn't supposed to be about just that, but it's another example of. Yeah. Thank you. Were there
I have a question.
Question.
Jump one in here. You mentioned before that one of the characters said something about why do they call Native Americans Indians? You meant they were called Indians for various purposes. Could you give me an example of a purpose to give Native people that?
Yeah, that's a whole other can of worms. So in the writings of Thomas King, and of course he's building on others, even like Vine Deloria, I mentioned earlier, that this idea of Indian, a fictional being, is something that we white Americans need in order to justify our behavior. So basically, this is our story that promotes westward expansion. It supports all of our treatments, like say the violence against Native peoples, because if they're savage, remember it goes back to that PowerPoint, the language of savagery. That if they're savages and white settlers or white Americans are civilized, then the Indian stereotype is used to justify the choices in that model. But I appreciated our Native American authors then, calling that out and complicating it. I know we don't have a whole lot of time left, but there are, just things some of you already mentioned that, Patrice is, when she's working at that jewel plant, she's smart and very determined and gutsy, and all the characters comment on that. And that's a far cry from the stereotype of the slovenly squaw, or Thomas, who is certainly not an alcoholic. And yet, of course, that's also part of the stereotype. More like, we have Eddie Mink probably fits the stereotype better. And so why does Erdrich leave in characters who then maybe reinforce the stereotypes? I'm sure she has her reasons for that as well. But Thomas is politically savvy, strategic, and makes an effort to understand his opponent. And we're done at 3, right, Barbara?
Yes.
Yeah.
Let me throw out a comment if I could, since we're getting.
Sure.
This is from Tracy. In her early books, Erdrich wrote in such a poetic style. She said in an interview that her intentionality didn't do that with her later books. I miss her early style. We talked a little bit about comparing this work to her other book early on. Do you sense the same, Barbara?
It's different. I think that because she started off her career as a poet, that her earlier works do reveal a style that is, I tend to think of some of her early works as lyrical. They have some poetic feeling to them. As I do love them, but I don't know that I like or dislike in comparison to what some people have referred to, like what on that slide, I showed the standalone books. Some of my colleagues have been referring to many of those as the social justice series. So books like Roundhouse or Plague of Doves or La Rose, and certainly Watchman, that they have significant issues of social justice throughout. That's her reason for creating these characters and these scenes. I mean, it's just so much more that I know we could talk about, but I guess I'll mention, I'll make myself a pitch. I'm teaching a summer course on Louise Erdrich. So if you want to read more and hang out and talk without the worry about being recorded on a Zoom session, come join me this summer. Even in the reviews that I did read one review, and it's almost like right on cue. When I read a review about a Native American work, there is somebody who says something like this. Let's see, I seemed to jump around. It was fragmented. I found my attention drifting, and it's like, well, this is somebody who doesn't really understand the circular, the interrelationship, and that this is a community telling the story. So yeah, this has been a lot of fun. Thanks for having me.
Barbara, when you get comments like that, and this will be the final question, what is your suggestion to your students or to someone who's not your student who starts to read a piece of literature that doesn't match their cultural understanding, and they get frustrated or they get perplexed, whatever the right word is? How do you encourage them to find a way to add that understanding to their the literature they read?
Yeah, thank you. I usually ask my students to think about, and of course they're adults, and so a lot of them have a boyfriend, girlfriend, significant others, spouses, and so I asked, how did you get to know the family of that person that you now have shared your life with? And I bet it wasn't easy, because you not only have to know the name and the history of the person you're involved with, but you have to know all the names of their family and all of the political comings and goings and all of their ways of doing things and the food they eat. It's getting to know your neighbors. And that fits nicely with what I see is going on with a big message of this, that what if Watkins had spent the time getting to know Native people to the way that Thomas had getting to know Watkins? That we just need to pay more attention to those people who are our neighbors. And so that's my final word, I guess.
Thank you.
And I enjoy Erdrich for reminding us of that.
I appreciate that. That's really a nice way for us to end the conversation today. I have many comments thanking you, Dr. Robbins.
Oh, thank you. It's been great
such
fun.
a wonderful look at Louise Erdrich's The Night Watchman. And you have opened the door for them to continue learning with you. I would say, our members, you're just getting a small view of the wonder that you might have as a student of Dr. Barbara Robbins at the University of Omaha. To our MC students, the personnel from the college, and the wonderful community that have joined us today, thank you for prioritizing your learning, celebrating the written word of Louise Erdrich. And there's many more opportunities out there under her pen, so check them out. Haven't had the chance to read this book yet, contact the MCC libraries to secure your copy, or do an internet search to get more familiar with her many renowned pieces of literature. Isaac, could you put up the evaluation slide, please? This address is in your chat. Please help us with an online evaluation. We would appreciate that. And then our next book discussion is The Personal Librarian. It will be held at noon on January 26th. We're very excited that one of the authors, Victoria Christopher Murray, will be our discussion leader. And these books as well are available to MCC students and personnel at the library, or, you know, with COVID, we've all become very accustomed to finding resources. So get out there and check it out. And I just want to thank everybody for making it a nice afternoon. Take care.
Thank you. Take care.